Everybody, I'm Josephine Gingerich. I am the Health Advocacy Outreach Coordinator for PSRPA, and I'm excited to be here today and super excited to introduce this all-star panel that we have. We're first going to hear from Sean O'Leary. Sean is the founder and senior researcher at the Ohio River Valley Institute, a nonprofit think tank that gets us the information we need with deep dives. I'm thrilled to hear from Sean. We'll next up hear from Tracy Carluccio, who is, I want to make sure I get her title right, the Deputy Director of the Delaware Riverkeeper Network. She's been an environmental advocate since 1989, and she's who I want to be when I grow up. She's incredible. And then lastly, we are going to hear from the fantastic Sandy Field. Sandy is the chair of the Climate Reality Project, Susquehanna Valley, PA chapter, and she formed Save Our Susquehanna, who has done some incredible work helping their communities and sticking up for others in central Pennsylvania. So I will pass it to Sean.
Thank you, Josephine, and thank you everyone for coming today. I really do appreciate it and appreciate the opportunity to talk with you. And I've got to say, there are some tough acts to follow here, because we've heard about the importance of being able to tell stories, being able to share our experiences, which sometimes, like with Cindy, with Bilal, the story he told with Quinn Glabicki, who documented a story that really touches my heart because it happened close to the community in which I grew up in West Virginia. And so I'm facing a real challenge here, because what I'm going to do is pivot from talking about those very compelling and moving personal stories to talk about statistics. Because the fact is that, as advocates, we would like it if our personal stories were so compelling that they would move policymakers to do the right thing. But the fact is that they often don't. And God knows, I'm sure most of the people in this room have encountered policymakers who tell us, I hear you, I understand with you, I empathize with you, but there are greater issues afoot here. Your stories are anecdotal. They're moving, but at the end of the day, I've got bigger fish to fry here. And that's especially true in what we do. And so, in addition to the compelling stories that we've been encouraged to share, I hope to use the next few minutes to help arm you to address the values that they care about, because not everybody shares our values. And sometimes we have to be able to speak to their values. And that's what I hope to be able to do with you for a few moments. And so, what I'm going to do is talk to you today about the economic impacts of the natural gas industry on our region, and specifically why those economic impacts are almost entirely contradictory to the narrative that we often hear about the industry, that it is an engine for economic development, for job creation, and for all things good. Because in fact, the numbers are quite compelling. They're not. And I want to do a second thing today, and that is ladder down from the natural gas industry itself to its downstream manifestations, because we all know what's happening in the power industry right now and the proliferation of gas-fired power plants. And then if you go another layer down, we know, God knows, all of us know about data centers and the hold that the issue of data centers has taken on so many people, both within the environmental and health movements, but also just regular citizens out there. But they are all joined in that they are all parts of the data center value chain. And we know the stakes that are being talked about here, because we hear it regularly in the news. We know that in the last round of elections, that people were talking about the importance of the fracking industry, that hundreds of thousands of jobs in Pennsylvania depend on it. We know that when recently at Carnegie Mellon, just down the road, when we had the energy summit at which more than $90 billion of investments were announced, that this stuff matters greatly. And we also know, as indicated in the slide in the lower right-hand corner, that we're hearing immense estimates of the amount of energy that we're going to require, which is used as a justification for more fracking and more power plant construction. Whoops. But there is something that constitutes a through line for all of those issues and all of those industries, and that is that they are almost all economically barren. Now, at the Ohio River Valley Institute for the last 5 years, I've been doing a series of reports on the economic impacts of the natural gas industry on Appalachia. And you can go see the reports at the Ohio River Valley Institute website. But what we've been doing specifically, and I'm going to start with natural gas because, again, it stands at the top of the value chain. But what we'll see is that the characteristics of natural gas happen to obtain when we start talking about gas-fired power generations and about data centers. And so what we've been doing at ORVI is following the economic trajectories of 30 counties in Ohio, Pennsylvania, and West Virginia. Now, the common denominator for these 30 counties is that they collectively produce 95% of all of the natural gas that comes from Appalachia. And those counties are, as you can see, strewn across the region between northeast Pennsylvania and the greater Ohio River Valley. And the question is, and I would also point out that these communities, which have a combined population of about 2 million people, if they were a state, they'd be the 38th largest state in the nation. I mean, this is not a small area. 2 million people is a substantial population. But the question is, how are they doing economically? Because, if we go back to the McCormick event that was held a few months ago, where they announced an astonishing $90 billion of investment. That sounds good, doesn't it? Because don't many reporters, frankly, hear those kinds of numbers and more or less do a little calculus in their heads that say tens of billions of dollars of investment must translate into lots of jobs and lots of economic opportunity. And that's why the investment figures are included in the headlines. Well, I got news for you. This area, these 30 counties, since the beginning of the natural gas boom, have received over $300 billion of investment. So if $100 billion or $90 billion of investment was a really good thing, these guys must be doing great, right? But we're going to see that that's not entirely the case. Because something weird happens. When you look at this region, you see something funny. In the first chart on the left, we compared what's going on in that region, which I call Frackalacha, to the US economy as a whole and to the combined economies of Ohio, Pennsylvania, and West Virginia. And we see two things first. First, we see that for the United States, when we're looking at gross domestic product, which for many people is the go-to statistic to assess economic prosperity, that it increased at a much higher rate than it did in Ohio and Pennsylvania and West Virginia. And we see also that household incomes are moving up in rough approximate lockstep with GDP growth. And then we see that although it's not as great in Ohio and Pennsylvania and West Virginia as it is in the US economy, we still see that lockstep relationship. But when you go to the column on the right that's circled, Frackalacha, you see something weird happening. You see GDP going up even greater than in the United States as a whole. But you look at incomes, and that lockstep relationship is utterly shattered. What that means is that when you hear those investment figures and what they're supposed to mean, that's not what they mean. because what's happening is that the dollars that are being invested are not flowing into our local communities by and large and are not being realized as income there. And that has tangible consequences, because when you go to the larger chart at the right, you see that whereas the United States economy as a whole grew by, employment grew by, or GDP, I'm sorry, excuse me, that looking at population first, grew by 10%, and the number of jobs grew by 13% in the economy as a whole, and you go all the way over to Appalachia, you see despite the fact that Appalachia had much healthier GDP growth than the US economy, we actually suffered losses, overall losses in jobs and in population. Now, this is a paradox economically, and it's one that for the last 5 years, I've spent my life trying to explain and understand, because the question immediately jumps to mind, how in the hell can that happen? And so we dug, I'm sorry, oops. I'm sorry. Oh, I'm pressing the wrong button, excuse me. Okay, so here are the results summarized as we've seen them. This is a ranking, if, as I said, if Appalachia were a state, we're ranking by GDP, increase in share of GDP. The green shaded states are the ones that saw growth. The red shaded states are the ones that saw decline. And there you see in position number 13, Appalachia, if it were a state, would have ranked 13th in GDP growth, which is pretty darn good. But when you look to the right of GDP at jobs and income and population, you see double-digit declines in all three of them. And so while we would have been 13th for GDP, 50th for jobs, 46th for income, and 52nd for population change, that's how big the disconnect is. And when we look at the Appalachian counties, and this is a list of the entire 30, we see that while some counties did better than others, and certainly a number of them did very well for GDP, almost categorically, they underperformed for jobs, population, and income. And so, in trying to figure out why this happens, we were able to identify a characteristic that drives this phenomenon. And it's a worrying characteristic, by the way, because it's one that is shared by downstream industries. And that is that the natural gas industry is uniquely capital intensive and not labor intensive. And that's a problem because it means that very little of the money that's either invested to expand the industry or that's earned by the industry in the form of revenue ever reaches local economies through paychecks, because there aren't very many of them. And at the same time, because it's not labor intensive and capital intensive, the industry as a whole is structurally incapable of being a foundation for economic development and job growth. It doesn't matter how much natural gas Pennsylvania produces. We could literally double the amount of production of natural gas in Pennsylvania, and it would have no measurable effect on jobs and income in the state. And that is a remarkable statistic. But then you think about all of the political projects and all of the subsidies that have been premised on the notion that by expanding our natural gas industry, we will be inducing economic prosperity. Now, the problem then is when you go downstream of natural gas and you go to data centers, you see that same characteristic kicking in. Data centers are spectacularly capital intensive and non-labor intensive. A 1,000 megawatt data center will typically on average employ about 27 people. And I got into a hell of a lot of trouble at a Kentucky Public Service Commission hearing a few months ago when I likened a data center's economic impact to an Olive Garden. But that's what it is. That is, in fact, what it is. And even when you're talking about the construction phase of data centers, there is a period when data centers will generate lots of jobs, just like the Shell cracker did in Monaca. You know, there were thousands and thousands of construction workers there for 18 months. And we, in fact, saw a huge spike in employment for that period, followed by a regression not to the mean, but a regression far below the mean, to the point that today, employment in Beaver County, Pennsylvania is less than it has been at any year in this century. And unfortunately, data centers, again, share that same characteristic where even in the construction phase, only about 2.5% of the money that's invested actually flows into local communities, host communities. And then gas-fired power plants. You know, we've got a lot of gas-fired power plants in the region. You can check them out. If you go to the Tenaska plant down in Westmoreland County, 1,000 megawatt power plant, you know how many people work there? 30. There's a 2,000 megawatt gas-fired power plant in Guernsey County, Ohio. It employs 25 people. It's another Olive Garden. And stacking one Olive Garden on top of another does not make for economic prosperity. And so when we look at the value chain from top to bottom, it's not going to happen. We will see, as we did with the natural gas boom, in investments in the tens and hundreds of billions of dollars without any measurable economic impact. And we're exacerbating the problem because, as many of you know, we're abating taxes right and left. We've already in Pennsylvania waived the sales and use tax, which is the primary tax generator for the state from business. And many communities are abating local property taxes because they, in the false notion, in the false belief that these are economic engines for prosperity. And it's to the point in Pennsylvania where, in rough comparison, when we look back at the data for a couple of years ago, it is literally the case that when you compare the amount of tax revenue that the data center industry is generating for Pennsylvania, it is less than the amount by which your electric bills went up because of data center development. It's actually a net financial loser for the state of Pennsylvania. And finally, we shouldn't overlook the fact that there is a reality under this, which is we hear constantly about skyrocketing demand for electricity. Well, as you can see from the chart at the top, which is the reality of the situation, we're looking at the states of Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Ohio, Delaware, Maryland, and West Virginia. None of those states has yet seen any measurable increase in electricity consumption. That's not to say it won't happen, and in fact it probably will. But as of today, no. Actually, there is no increase in demand for electricity. And that's how much the rhetoric is outrunning the actuality of the situation. At the bottom, you see what the load forecast is, and that red line that's going up, that's what PJM is predicting for us. Now, the green line beneath that is their earlier projection, which they recently upped. But the blue line is a more realistic projection of what's likely to happen. But that gap is particularly pernicious because right now we're being steamrolled into building one hell of a lot of gas-fired generation in anticipation of load that may never materialize and for which we'll ultimately have to pay. And so I just want to close by saying to everybody here, because I'm a researcher, a lot of you guys are advocates out there. There are 5 things that I hope that you will do in your communities and in the state legislature. The first thing is demand transparency. God knows we've heard today how important that is. The second thing is to don't abate taxes. Just don't, ever, under any circumstance. It does not make any sense. The third is develop special tariffs, electricity rates for data centers so that their costs are not shifted to you, because that's what's happening right now in Pennsylvania and why your utility bills are going up. The fourth thing is special zoning. We heard Cindy Fisher talk about the need and the power of zoning. And then the last thing is go negotiate community benefit agreements. If you're going to get a data center, then make sure you drive the toughest and best deal possible, because while people may be pro-fracking or anti-fracking, pro-data center or anti-data center, the one thing that nobody should be for, pro or against, is for a bad deal. And right now, that's what Pennsylvania is getting, a really bad deal. Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, Sean. A reminder to write your questions down on your notepads as they come to you, and we'll pick them up at the end.
Excellent.
Next up is the wonderful Tracy Carluccio.
Which one advances?
The one at the top.
It's the green play button.
Hello, thank you for having Delaware Riverkeeper Network here today to speak. And I'm going to be talking about liquefied natural gas and why it's a dead end for Pennsylvania. So we've been talking today about the pressure that we're all feeling across the Commonwealth by the fracking industry and their supporters to develop more frack gas. And the drivers of this are data centers and also fueling and feeding markets for liquefied natural gas exports. The federal rollback of environmental regulations is also contributing to this pressure. And also the claims that the protective regulations actually depress energy development in Pennsylvania is a theme that we hear over and over, and from many of our Pennsylvania legislators. And what does this result in? The development of frack gas across the entire state. If they were to develop liquefied natural gas exports, it would be dumped on the public. We've heard today, and we've heard at these conferences before, about the human health and environmental harms, the degradation of communities, and also economic instability because of our electricity costs skyrocketing. Also, we'll see, of course, an escalation of the climate crisis because of the greenhouse gas emissions, primarily methane, that would result with increased fracking. And let me just focus for a minute on the economic impacts of the export of LNG. LNG exports will lock us into an economic downward spiral. That's because when gas is exported, they fetch a higher price, and then Pennsylvania has to compete on the world market. Over half of Pennsylvanians use gas for heating their homes, and 60% of Pennsylvania's electricity is supplied by gas plants. So when the price goes up, we all feel it, and the consumer has to pay that price. We saw this when the Ukraine war began. The prices for gas spiked in Pennsylvania because we're playing on the world stage. What has happened in Pennsylvania since the fracking frenzy began is we have become totally dependent on natural gas. And being dependent on one source of gas means that we don't have the economic stability we need or the energy security that we need. So there's a lot of political pressure that we're feeling in the Delaware River watershed that I'd like to share. And this is going to lead to a fracking escalation statewide because those who are pushing this, where that pressure is coming from, wants that. U.S. Senator Dave McCormick, he did a Road to Energy Dominance Runs Through Pennsylvania commentary. And he said that Penn America Energy, which was the company trying to push one of the LNG facilities in the Delaware River watershed, and the Pennsylvania Building Trades are collaborating on this $7 billion project, and we're going to be building it in Eddystone. And that was the first time that the public heard anything about this. Also, U.S. Congressman Bresnahan wants to overturn the ban that we have in place in the Delaware River watershed. He said he wants, to mount the energy dominance, all the Trump and MAGA type of rhetoric that we've heard for so long. He wants us to help get our gas rights back and to capitalize on energy under our feet. And he has even enlisted the Trump administration by bringing Lee Zeldin up to his district in Pennsylvania in order to push for overturning the ban. So let me just take a minute in case folks don't know. What is LNG? Liquefied natural gas, or is actually natural gas that's been cooled down to a liquid state. And it goes down to about minus 260 degrees Fahrenheit. And they do this so they can ship it more easily and they can store it more easily. Because natural gas is more than 95% methane, it's basically liquid methane. The volume of natural gas in its liquid state is about 600 times smaller than its volume in its gaseous state. So it makes it easier to transport the LNG, particularly overseas, but it also makes it more explosive and more dangerous to handle. So we have real-time LNG export threats in our watershed. The Delaware River ports are huge. They used to be owned by the oil and gas industry. A lot of those refineries have shut down now. But instead, we have brownfields, we have areas where they want to redevelop new fossil fuel projects. So the one that we've been fighting since 2019 is on the New Jersey side of the river. It's right across from where they want to build the one in Pennsylvania. And that Gibbstown LNG export terminal is one that has not been built. It's been held up, and we hope to see it dead eventually. Penn America, and now called Eddystone Energy, wants to export an LNG facility from southeastern Pennsylvania. And we've been fighting that since 2022. So I want to give you a picture here of what we have on the Delaware River in terms of these ports and these two sites. As you can see, Eddystone LNG, it's on the upside of the Delaware River. And then the one that they want to build in Gibbstown or across that on the New Jersey side, it's about 10 minutes south of Philadelphia. And note that the Pennsylvania and Delaware state line is downriver about 6 miles. And they do not allow liquefied natural gas export terminals in Delaware in the Coastal Zone Management Zone, so they won't be building them there. Oh, but one thing I'd like to point out, to go back. I don't know how to go backwards. Well, one thing I'd like to point out about the map. I want to focus on Eddystone for a minute. Delaware Riverkeeper Network files, right-to-know law requests regularly with several agencies in Pennsylvania and the federal government to try to glean information about the project, because there really is nothing public. The only way anybody knows anything about this is because of right-to-know requests. We share this information publicly so people can know what is being proposed for where they work and live. And we want to keep, of course, ahead of the project's movement towards permitting, because then often it's way too late to try to have any impact on a project. One thing is very clear that we have learned from these right-to-know requests. There has been and continues to be a pressure, tremendous amount of energy and resources being spent by the project supporters to lobby government and elected officials behind the scenes. Secret meetings of company representatives with the agencies is standard, including the Department of Community and Environmental Development, Governor Shapiro's office, even the White House, even some of these agency staff, when you read these right-to-know emails, sound as if they actually work for the company. They talk about, they're so infatuated with this project that they're going to be building pipelines and export terminals, processing plants. All of the infrastructure that we know comes with this is actually something they're touting. So I think it's really important for us to realize that this is being hidden from the public, and it's wrong. But communities are fighting back. And we work with Chester residents concerned for quality living. We work with PSR. We work with groups all throughout our Delaware River watershed. Berg's Gas Truth. We have a network of organizations fighting these LNG facilities. And it really matters because we have to have a group effort. We have to be united. So we don't say, we don't want it here, but it's going to go over there. No LNG export at all in the Delaware River ports. So what do? How do we do this? Well, we work on advocacy, frontline defense, education, and that information sharing. Remember, ignorance is not bliss. We have to know what's going on in order to develop an effective strategy to have input on it. We have legal challenges with the Gibbstown facility, many, many legal challenges over the year. We're in court right now. Community and local government organizing. We were very successful in organizing along the infrastructure, where they wanted to actually move LNG by rail, which was banned by the federal government, about 200 miles through Pennsylvania, including Philadelphia, and through New Jersey down to Gibbstown. And resolutions were passed, people learned about it, and that was a very effective thing to do. So we also are fighting, of course, the terminal itself at Gibbstown, LNG, transportation through truck, which is another option that they say they're going to be using. And also, very important, the marine vessel route. And the reason that's important is because it will go right by, within a mile of the within the navigation channel of Delaware, and also close to New Jersey. And those are basically bomb ships. They're carrying an explosive force that equals 68 Hiroshima bombs. And it's really important for people who live in those states, as well as the people in Philadelphia and in Delaware County and southeastern PA, where they want to put this, to know what they're facing. So for Penn America, the processing plant is a big deal, and I'm going to talk about that in a minute. So we have cradle-to-grave impacts here. We have the impacts from the fracked well to the end use. That's why all of Pennsylvania is going to be impacted. And we also have the fracking fluids. We've heard a great presentation here today about the fluids that they use. They have to get them to the site. They have to store them there, and then they inject them. And then we have the toxic wastewater that's produced, and they have to do something with. We have the pipelines and compressors, which have their own health impacts on communities. We have the liquefaction process, which I'll go into in a minute, which is very polluting for the people in proximity. We have storage, and that's caused some of the worst accidents in LNG are related to the storage. And then also we have the shipping and then the end use. So the end use, remember, they get this LNG to a port, they regasify it, and then they burn it. Typically, they use it for generating electricity, so that's another source of pollution. So what are the LNG hazards? Well, the federal government has guidelines, not good laws, but they have guidelines, and you're supposed to put these things in remote locations. And that's not southeastern Pennsylvania. It's not the Delaware River ports. It's not Pittsburgh. It's no place where people are densely populated. LNG release cannot be controlled. Once the liquid hits the atmosphere, in a matter of minutes, it expands to 620 times in volume of what it was in that storage container. And remember, it's super cooled. So we got this minus 260 degrees Fahrenheit, very cold vapor that is formed. And that cold vapor kills people because it robs oxygen from the air if you are within proximity. It also freezes skin immediately. And also, this LNG and brittle steel. That's why it's so difficult to store it. It's so difficult to handle it safely. And that's how one of the worst accidents, well, the most recent terrible accident that occurred was in Freeport at an LNG facility in Texas, where they didn't even notice cracks were developing in one of their storage containers, and it exploded. And it was a disaster. So also, it only takes static electricity, a spark, to actually ignite a vapor cloud that is caused by LNG. And the fire burns so hot that they can't extinguish it. Fire companies are advised, try to get people out of the way and let it burn. You can't put it out. Imagine having a fire that hot in a city, and who would be killed in minutes, who would be able to evacuate. And it explodes with bomb force. I mentioned about the force of these in a ship, but I want to also mention a little bit more about explosion and fire. So there was a recent LNG risk assessment that shows that the blast zone that can occur will impact up to 3.8 square mile area, and anything flammable could ignite within about 2 miles. So then on top of that, you have the risk of a domino effect and more severe damage. You have loss of life, and you have infrastructure damage. The ships that transport the LNG endanger the entire region as well. And the worst explosion, according to this risk assessment, the worst case explosion would impact 10.5 miles. So we're talking about the region of an entire, the most densely populated area in all of Pennsylvania being subjected to this threat. So there's also very little training. Pennsylvania has no experience with LNG. The Delaware River ports have no experience with LNG. There's no equipment to handle this. I want to just touch a minute on what the impacts are to the proximate communities, because they're very important. There's air pollution from LNG processing that is highly toxic. And this is a typical Pennsylvania DEP air quality plan. You can see, and I'm being told I have 5 minutes, so you can just read them quickly, but you'll see these are a lot of the toxic compounds that we talked about here today, and we know they have very serious health effects. And we need to also realize that the Delaware Valley fails to meet minimum federal air quality standards for ozone, and it consistently does so more than any other any other area in Pennsylvania. And smog then is formed, and that leads to code orange days. You may have noticed we've had code orange days the last 3 or 4 days because of an inversion. We already have too much NOx. We have too much VOCs. We have too much of every one of these chemicals. We cannot take one more. So, what are our most formidable challenges? Well, government and corporate lack of transparency. It's really a problem. Subterfuge, there's actually lies that are told in order to get us off the case. Non-disclosure agreements. The Department of Community and Economic Development in Pennsylvania has actually entered into a non-disclosure agreement with Eddystone Energy, LLC, which is the company that's replaced Penn America to push the LNG project. Now that is shocking. We found that out through our right to know. Even the Eddystone Borough has entered into an NDA with the company. We were denied these records. We're in court fighting that. We're trying to get those records so we can see exactly what they're hiding. Why don't they tell the people about it if it's so great? We have poor government regulation. We have poor oversight of that regulation. We also, despite the lack of economic viability, projects move ahead. It seems like they don't even care whether or not they're going to be successful economically. They still go ahead and get the financial backing they need. They float bonds, sometimes with the support of the government, and they're out there building these things. And they will move ahead unless we stop them. There's the false jobs and prosperity story that we heard so eloquently about from Sean. And of course, we have the shifting legal underpinnings at both the federal and state levels. Nobody really knows where the bottom is today under the Trump administration. And all of this leads to an overload on our communities. It overloads our local governments. It overloads our social structures. And one thing I do want to say in closing is that as environmental organizations, we have to stop accepting halfway measures, endorsing bad legislation and regulations because there may be some crumbs of good in there only perpetuates the polluting projects that we're trying to stop. It also burdens communities and the environment disproportionately. And that's where those facilities and their infrastructure go. So it's irresponsible of our environmental organizations to say, okay, we'll go along with Governor Shapiro's lightning plan or HB 502 because there might be a few crumbs in there for renewables. No. We need to stand up and we need to say, stop fracking and its infrastructure and operations in Pennsylvania. And we need to develop instead renewable energy sources like wind and solar. That is the answer, period. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tracy. Don't go for the crumbs, everybody. All right. Lastly, we have the amazing Sandy Field. Got this.
All right. Hi, everyone. I'd just like to thank PSR for inviting me today to speak to you about our work in central Pennsylvania with rural communities. I'm going to tell you about a couple of site fights that we've done in central Pennsylvania, and I just want to emphasize right now that we are volunteers and we do this work with the support and experience from so many different organizations in Pennsylvania, folks who are here today who I've just met in 3D, which is awesome, who have been supporting us the whole way, and who we couldn't have done this without. And I'm going to mention a few people, and if I forget somebody, I apologize in advance. So the first thing you need to know, this is a summary of rural organizing in central Pennsylvania. I just tell people when they join the chapter, it's all uphill. This is what it's like in rural PA, and that's just how it is. And I mean, it seems like it's a statewide thing, actually, but our chapter has basically this catchment area. It's very sparsely populated, so we have a few volunteers in each of these counties, and I always say we're 10 old ladies in central Pennsylvania. And the first story I want to tell you about is our work in Renovo, Pennsylvania, which is in Clinton County, where that little star is. This is an area of Pennsylvania in the Pennsylvania wilds. Dark skies, hunting, fishing, camping, rail trails, the best of Pennsylvania, really. People cherish those things there. And Renovo's no different. It's in this adorable little elbow of the Susquehanna River. This is the west branch of the Susquehanna. It's 5 blocks by 3 blocks. It's a little town. It's one of those places that used to have a railroad, and it used to be, a stop on a railroad, coal mining and timber went through there, and then the railroad pulled out and they've been left behind. And so when a 1,200 megawatt gas-fired power plant was proposed on that site, which right here is where the old railroad was. They wanted to put it there on that site. People thought, what Sean was talking about, jobs, prosperity, the whole thing, finally we're going to get something good in Renova. So I won't go into all of this text, but the project when we joined had been in progress for some time. They had had a permit, they had to do a renewal, they had proposed a bigger project. There was legal action against the appealing the second air permit that they were applying for. That work was being done by Clean Air Council. Kat and Lisa, who are here from Environmental Integrity Project, Centers for Biological Diversity, and Penn Future were involved in all of that legal action. And they wanted to have some folks come in and work on the ground doing some organizing in the town. And we had some members who were in Clinton County, so we agreed to help. So how did we fight them? So at first we thought, the usual approaches, township supervisors, I think it's actually borough council there, and that sort of thing. And we quickly found out that it was one of those small places where the borough council were all related to each other. They were related to the mayor. They were used to getting their own way. They were in favor of the plant. The guy who was on the Economic Development Committee was also the guy who owned the rail station land and was selling it to the company to build the thing. I talked to the local reporter in town. He was in favor of the plant. So all of those things kind of weren't our usual levers were not there for us. And so we did have some folks in town who were willing to speak up. One of the women was accosted in the grocery store one of the women was spit on by her own Republican representative who she voted for. One of the women came out one morning and found a bullet hole through her windshield. And so, needless to say, it was a hostile environment. And so we weren't quite sure how to proceed with the grassroots organizing that we had hoped to do, but we didn't want our folks, our supporters in the town to feel abandoned, and we didn't want them to also feel threatened. So in this case, we had a public meeting that didn't actually go particularly well. I might have time to talk about that more later, but the way we ended up succeeding was to work from the outside of this community. We wrote letters to the editor, we wrote letters to the investors, we did public comments on the permits, we helped with we had Clean Air Council and those guys working on the legal aspects of things. And so our idea was that if somebody wanted to support Renovo Energy Center, which had been having trouble getting investors, that they'd Google that and they'd find a bunch of letters from angry people in the newspaper. So that's what we did, and that worked. So Bechtel pulled out. They weren't going to build the thing. We won, and you can see here our last Zoom meeting where we all were celebrating, and it was a lot of fun. And so that's how we approached it in Renova. And now I want to tell you about a different fight that we did, which we developed a group called Save Our Susquehanna for. One thing I'll tell you about rural areas in Pennsylvania is folks don't want to be climate activists. They don't want to be carrying signs and chanting and stuff. So we developed a different group that didn't have climate in the name, called Save Our Susquehanna, that emphasized the river and the rural way of life. And that really kind of helped us to attract folks to the group and step away from that kind of my main concern, which is we shouldn't be going in this direction for these things because of climate change. But this fight was in Point Township, Pennsylvania. You can see here, this is actually closer to where I live. This is this one was on the north branch of the Susquehanna River. Oh, and here, I'll show you, there was almost the same picture of where we are right now in my hotel of the two branches of the river coming together to this point. There's more buildings on this part. But this is us, this is what they call Point Township at the Point, which is something I learned during this fight. The West Branch comes in and the North Branch comes in, and they come together at Northumberland, and then, I guess I should be using this. Over here is Sunbury, Pennsylvania, which is an environmental justice community. And so I haven't even told you that what we were fighting was an advanced plastics recycling plant. And I'm going to tell you about that in a minute. But the plant was going to be here, upriver from these communities. So the plant was going to be $1 billion advanced recycling plant bringing post-consumer plastic, 450,000 tons per year, melt it down or vaporize, it was their first word, into pyrolysis oil, which would then be fractionated into chemicals, benzene, toluene, xylene, and propylene, which would be stored on site and then sent to their suppliers. You can see here, oops, I didn't mean to do that. Can I go backwards? Can you go backwards for me? So there's railroad tracks along here. You can see the site was right along the river. This is the site here in red. And they were going to ship these chemicals by rail along the river to their suppliers who were going to make more plastic. So it was it's recycling, right? It's going to make, they're going to make new plastic from the waste plastic. So here are the concerns of the local residents. We were concerned about air pollution. water pollution, forever chemicals have been mentioned a couple of times here with the process of washing and sorting the plastics, with melting the plastics down. This group probably knows that anything involving plastic involves 20,000 toxic chemicals that are not regulated. We were concerned about 24/7, 365 operation of the plant, all light and noise pollution, 100 trucks per day of waste plastic were going to be coming to this little rural area of this little small highway in between Danville and Northumberland, Pennsylvania. So how did we fight them? In this case, we didn't have the same hostile environment. Boyne Township wasn't welcoming, but they listened to us. Gosh, and sometimes we'd go in there and talk for an hour and a half, and they would listen. We pushed all the buttons. We talked to the press. We had yard signs. We had mailers. We had students who joined our group, and they went to the neighborhood across the street from the proposed site, and they knocked on doors. And those folks were like, well, we didn't know anything about this, or they thought it was a done deal. $1 billion coming, of course it's going to get built. But all those people, when they found out what was coming and the toxicity of the thing, joined the group. And so we ended up being really successful in getting the word out. We were on the radio, we had op-eds, everyone joined the group. What was amazing to me was everybody hates plastic. Everybody recognized that plastics pollution was a problem, and a lot of people had the same reaction as I had when I first heard about it. Oh, recycling, that's a big problem, we need to do that. But then we would talk about, the chemicals along the railway and the melting of the plastic and everything, and so we had people join the group. So it ended up being this big unwieldy group of everybody. And that's fantastic, but it also has its own challenges of, differing opinions, different political views, different approaches to things, infighting among people. So there was challenges, but we really were able to reach everybody. We also had good relationships with our local press. We went and talked to them, and they were also going to be affected by the traffic. So they didn't write biased articles about our project, about our concerns, but they did come to all of our events, and they, when Encina, the company that was going to build the plant, had their own, little company message in the newspaper or their own open house or whatever, they would ask us for a comment. So we end up being able to get our point of view out, our concerns, our legitimate concerns about this project into the press. So, and I wanted to mention also, we ended up having someone join the group who used to work for DEP, and so we were able to go talk to DEP. We had a really nice time with them, and so it was a completely different experience from Renova, right? Not hostile at all. Everyone was able to do things their own way and communicate with the people that around them. And so it just worked out to be a really different experience, just based on the differences in the communities. So we won. Encina said the site wasn't big enough to produce the amount of chemicals they needed to produce for the demand from their clients, and so they were going to go move somewhere else. So I want to just tell you a couple of things about what we learned comparing these two fights. So first of all, clearly there's differences in the community. So it's important to understand the rural community. Many people who have spoken here already have emphasized the importance of the impacted folks, the impacted voices. Those folks who lived across the street from the highway from the proposed site, some of them had like built a house there to retire in with a view of the river. And then they were going to have a chemical plant across the street. So when they spoke, you know, the township supervisors listened. It was really very, very compelling. And they were very brave. Some of them were terrified to speak at zoning meetings and stuff. They were really great. People in rural areas feel very connected to the land. Emphasizing the river and the impacts on the land and the air was really the secret sauce of how we got such a big group and was so successful where we were. People like where they live, and they like their way of life, and they like that it's dark and that it's quiet and that there's not every grocery store and everything. They like it that way. Let people do what they're comfortable with. Again, I mentioned that folks, no minutes. Okay, I only have, this is my last slide. Okay, but I'll talk it faster. People in central Pennsylvania are not comfortable being activists. So we had one guy who had a different political point of view from me. He organized 2 public meetings on his own. He did it in a way that I would not have done it, and it was totally successful. You know, just let people do what they want to do and let them be awesome and support them, and that has worked for me every time. We had great small town connections, as well as the connections with everyone knows their supervisors where I live. We could have tremendous access to our local representatives. Don't say climate change, talk about the river, talk about pollution, the Orvie and I think Break Free from Plastics were doing studies at the time about the impact of advanced recycling, and language to use to talk about it. And it turned out that when we talked about toxins and poisons, that was really very compelling for people. And you know, other impacts we didn't talk about. So we learned a lot from, again, our coalition partners. Don't let interpersonal differences disrupt the group. I spent so much time on the phone with people. It's just a thing. I'm hurrying, okay. And there's only 2 more. Don't let the company control the message. You guys know this. They control their own public meetings and things. And they don't want you to hear what other people are asking and things like that. So, and celebrate your wins. This is our last Zoom for this group. Some of the people in this room are in here. Josephine's in there. So anyway, if you have any questions, please contact me. And thank you very much for your attention.
All right, folks, write your notes, write your questions on your note cards and hold them up, and the lovely people over on this table will come grab them for you. We'll start with one that I had for everybody. What can folks do now in their communities that may or may not have an imminent threat of a specific facility? Obviously, that depends on the scope of how you define community, right? Just like, rather than not in my backyard, we want not on planet Earth at all. And how can they build resilience and durability as a community?
Well, I can start. I think communication is the most important thing. Sharing what you know. We have regular meetings of our network, and we share what we've learned. And people don't hold back because they have this, you know, for whatever agenda they might have. People share. All our right-to-know requests, records that we receive, we put on our website. Anybody can go and read them. Thousands of pages, but you know, you're welcome to. And that's the way that we really can engage people, because we've heard this theme over and over today. That's the way people get energized and engaged, by knowing how it's going to affect them. So I think that's one of the most important things. The other thing is to have networks include organizations that work together. And one of the things, like for instance, the Chester Residents Concerned for Quality Living, which is run by Zuline Mayfield and has been there for 30 years in Chester, that organization did not go away after they kicked the Penn America LNG facility out of their town. It went next door to Eddystone, and so we're organizing there now. So that is really important, that we realize that no place is a good place for pollution.
Thank you. And do you want to add anything else? Okay. I think this one, well, feel free, whoever. I think this might be Sean. Why does the industry call propane propane with no other strange/inaccurate terms like natural gas? Why did the industry, call methane natural gas? Is this an admittance to it being more than methane?
You nominated me? Excuse me. There's a lot of terminology that's thrown around, not just by the industry, but on all sides. And there are wars over, should we even use the term natural gas? I think earlier I heard a speaker today refer to it as methane gas. And I try not to get too hung up in the terminology, and I'll tell you why primarily, because a moment ago I devoted a portion of my discussion to talking about the need to appeal to people who may not share our values. And frankly, sometimes we use terminology that to people outside the movement sounds pretty foreign and pretty uncharacteristic. And when using that, it causes people sometimes to pigeonhole us or just begin to dismiss what we have to say. So I will tell you frankly that I'm a major proponent of using language that's familiar to the people in the audience that you're trying to talk to, even if we may disagree that natural gas is or isn't natural or what have you. But I think most of all, the paramount thing that we can do is to speak to people on their terms and speak to their values.
Thank you. All right. I think I'm going to pick on Tracy. What compels states to lie about the financial benefits of energy, LNG, and data centers? I can't imagine lobbying giving them that much money.
Lobbyists, campaign contributions.
Yeah.
I mean, that's what we're facing. I mean, the industry pretty much owns Pennsylvania. And that's why we heard Katie Muth saying, we have to fight back that way. We have to make sure that the ownership of the Commonwealth is in the hands of the people. Anything less is a violation of the Environmental Rights Amendment of the Constitution of Pennsylvania.
I just want to kick in. Most of the time, my experience is they're not lying. They believe it. And I mean, I work a lot with folks like county commissioners and things like that. And one of the lessons that I've learned in doing it is that, we're talking in the greater Ohio River Valley, outside of Pittsburgh in Allegheny County. Frankly, the economy has been pretty abysmal for the better part of the last 50 or 60 years. And so when, going back to 2008, 2009, when the frackers started rolling in, offering property owners agreements, they were saying, we're going to invest $1 billion or $2 billion in your county. And if I'm a county commissioner and I'm sitting there on the backside of 40 or 50 years of economic decline, my reaction is probably going to be something along the lines of, how can I help? Because it sounds good and I got nothing else to bank on. And so I think a lot of our policymakers, even up to the state level, genuinely believe this stuff. I don't think everyone is cynical. And I hope that when we approach policymakers, and maybe Jean Yaw isn't in this category, but I do hope that in most cases we can approach policymakers and accepting them as sincere in what they believe, however misguided it may be.
Thank you so much. We're out of time with these questions. I will make sure that they get them. No, you're all good. But yeah, thank you to our lovely speakers for this awesome panel.
We're going to take a couple of minutes for our next panel to get set up for creative protests. Thank you to the 104 people online, if you can see me, for remaining here with us. Please, everyone, stay for this panel and also our closing speaker, because I think that's going to be a special story as well.